And good afternoon. I'm quite glad to see many of you here. This is a nice and interesting session that we're going to have, and I'm quite grateful to our partners, in particular to Bocconi University and Professor Croci with CFME, and with the University of Edinburgh for having jointly organized this session on multi-level climate governance and integrated analysis of national, regional and local policies. It's a quite ambitious session which starts from the recognition that INDCs are a major important step in climate policy, a major turning point in climate policy, because for the first time, if actually implemented, emission will stop increasing and will be stabilized. This is a crucial, important step, but the subsequent one requires implementation, requires policies to implement INDCs at the national, regional, and local level. And that's why this session is important, because we are trying to identify idea, proposal, best practices to deliver the implementation of the INDCs. This session has been designed to help all policymakers, governments, business leaders, and the NGO communities to understand more these issues of implementation. We have several papers. The rule of the game is that all presenters will not spend more than 10 minutes on presentation, just to leave all of you at least half an hour for discussion, questions, and remarks. But I would like to start quickly by giving the floor to Professor Croci, who co-organized with me this session, and will introduce the session more formally through a set of slides. All the speakers will use the podium for their own presentation, and given that we don't have a pointer, they will ask for a change of slides to Martina, who is sitting over there. So, Eduardo, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I also take the occasion to thank Professor Carlo Carraro for jointly organizing this event. It is very clear, just coming here to Le Bourget, that the role of regions and cities is important, together, of course, with the role of nations, even from the presence of a pavilion dedicated to their activities. And in my brief introductory speech, I will try to give an overall perspective of the interactions among the different levels of governance for climate mitigation. So, top-down and bottom-up approaches to mitigation will probably coexist after Paris. This is a situation quite different from the first Kyoto Protocol, where there was an overall compulsory agreement with obligatory targets for industrialized countries. This is a situation where voluntary commitments at all levels are admitted and fostered, and the global framework made up by the INDCs is basically a collection of non-homogeneous voluntary commitments in a situation of a fragmented regulatory system. At the same time, with a bottom-up perspective, several initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are being undertaken by subnational authorities. Just to mention a few of them, the Compact of Mayors and the Covenant of Mayors in Europe are initiatives involving thousands of municipalities, and also private stakeholders are relevant actors in this regime. Recent data from the Carbon Climate Registry report 2.2 gigaton of CO2 equivalent annual emissions released by over 600 jurisdictions from 62 countries worldwide, which shows an impressive potential of subnational actors to contribute to global mitigation efforts. It is important to note that in most cases, INDCs don't include at the moment these voluntary commitments by subnational actors. Finally, the new emerging regime is politically feasible, clearly, but it is not cost efficient because there is no equalization of marginal abatement costs of actions. This sort of collection of different commitments at different scales, of course, does not allow this equalization. Subnational authorities are increasingly recognized as key players for climate change mitigation. In fact, they have several competencies in sectors that are relevant for energy production and use. If we look at different countries worldwide, of course there are different competencies of subnational actors, different jurisdictions, even different names of the different subnational actors. So we cannot just speak of a standard subnational actor, but in spite of that, we know that all of them have relevant competencies in the fields of energy, some of them for urban planning, for waste collection, for mobility, for electricity use, and in some examples even generation. So very relevant competencies in this topic. The current version of the draft Paris outcome, which of course will be modified and is under negotiation, recognizes the importance of the engagement of all levels of government and various actors in addressing climate change, and this is part of a preamble of the possible agreement. An effective implementation of INDCs will therefore need to comprehend a multi-stakeholder and multi-level approach. At the same time, frameworks and MRV tools accounting for greenhouse gas reduction actions occurring at different scales is strongly needed for overall system integrity. In lack of this kind of instruments, there is no possibility of having reductions which are all equivalent to the same ton of CO2. So after Paris, I think that there will be a process trying to have these instruments really active in order to guarantee integrity. We also have to note that the role of multi-level governance and of actors at different scale is not something that is happening only in Paris for this COP21. In September, this September, a couple of months ago, in New York, the General Assembly of the United Nations approved 17 Sustainable Development Goals, substituting the Millennium Development Goals and valid from now to year 2030. These targets show that energy and climate are a transversal issue for almost all of these targets, and there is a specific target, number 11, sustainable cities and communities, which is focused on local activities. So again, in this parallel and convergent process of SDGs, there is a multi-level approach which is relevant. According to the World Bank, currently almost 40 countries and more than 20 cities, states and provinces worldwide already use carbon pricing mechanisms or are planning to implement them, and they actually cover, let's say, around 10% or a little less of global emissions. And if more economic instruments and carbon pricing systems, both with taxes and emission trading, will add in the next years, this can cover a relevant and significant two-digit reduction contributing to global mitigation. So this carbon pricing mechanism at different levels, again, at a multi-level scale, can give a substantial contribution to mitigation. Nevertheless, according to the OECD, carbon rates in place in many countries are still too low to be effective. In fact, only 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are priced over 30 euros, while the others are priced a lower level, which is not really effective in the current situation. In this phase, common framework and rules for a comprehensive carbon market is lacking. Two alternatives confront each other. One is bottom-up integration through linking of currently disconnected national, regional and local emission trading system, and the other one is a top-down definition of a system for a global emission trading market through the development of a framework for various agreements and the new market mechanism under the UNFCCC in order to assure fungibility of carbon units. It is not realistic to think that this will emerge of Paris. This will be probably a topic that will be developed in the next couple of years. We will see the emergence of new carbon trading markets and the link of these carbon trading markets. At the same time, the next negotiations will have to find a way in order to allow the fungibility of carbon units derived by market and non-market activities. This is a very relevant topic which the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention already started to develop a few years ago, but which is not yet mature. It is not yet mature, and in fact, in these negotiations, we haven't heard a lot about the framework for various agreements and the new market mechanism. And lastly, I just want to mention a couple of researches which we are performing at Bocconi University Milan at the Center for Economics and Policy of Energy and Environment. One project is called COP21, and it is on multi-level cooperation between regional and municipal scales. And basically, I don't have the time to pass through this slide completely, but basically what emerges is there are very different models of cooperation between these two levels, and these models coexist sometimes, are not exclusive. In some of these models, it is the region the key player in a sort of top-down approach. In other cases, it's more of a municipalities with a bottom-up approach. In some other cases, it's the national governments imposing to the lower levels to do something, like is in the case in France, where municipalities over 50,000 inhabitants are obliged to develop their own sustainable energy action plans. And lastly, from another research we are performing with the European Commission Joint Research Center, it emerges that there are some significant drivers for emissions in cities. We have some important guests today working on these topics. I just mentioned Christopher Kennedy on that. And the work the scientific work trying to understand what are the drivers, the determinants of emissions in cities is an ongoing work, quite difficult to do also because cities are quite different entities for size, geographical location, kinds of activities in place and so on. But it is very relevant to understand what are these determinants in order to design effective policy to reduce emissions in cities. And this is a very relevant research area. We will also talk in this signed event, which, if I can add a last consideration, I think is particularly interesting because we see different scientific perspectives from researchers all over the world about this multi-level governance, looking at the different scales from different perspectives. And that's all. And of course, I'm available for further information.
Thank you. Thank you, Eduardo, for this introduction. Quite useful and gives an idea of the wide spectrum of issues that we're going to tackle. But let's start immediately with the first presentation. We start from the macro level and we will go down to the regional and local levels. The first presenter is Professor Scott Barber from Columbia University. He is an expert, well-known expert of international negotiations, but also of climate policy, then implementation of climate policy. He will talk in particular about what's going to happen beyond COP21 and then beyond Paris, because the real problems and the real issues will start to concern all of us once this COP21 is going to be finished. Thank you very much, Scott, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlo, and thank you everyone for coming. Now, it's very dangerous to give a professor a microphone without also a timepiece with some reminders. So can someone kick me or something as my time draws near? I want to talk about the process that we're all a part of here, and also what comes next, because whatever is achieved here, and hopefully something will be achieved here, something I think all of us want, it's never going to be enough. It will just simply not be enough. So the main message I want to share is that we need to build on what is achieved here by developing the processes that are set into motion here, but also we need to pursue other avenues that are parallel, not in competition with, but parallel with the approach that will be adopted here. And then also I think we need to be thinking about more radical steps in the future. Oh, no, you've already gone too far. I'm not that fast, I'm very slow. Yeah, okay, good. The first thing is, what will success at COP21 look like? Well, one reason that we can anticipate getting some success is because what we're aiming for is something that's fundamentally voluntary. So if you go to the concept of an INDC, intended, nationally determined contribution, all of this is all couched in the language of voluntary action. And it's a lot easier to get countries to sign up to something when the actions are voluntary than when they're mandatory. Bear in mind as well with the INDCs that they are numbers, and behind the numbers are policies and a lot of other things that countries can't control. And sometimes they're based on using international mechanisms, and often, many of them are calculated relative to business as usual, BAU, which people talk about as if everyone knows what it is, but no one knows exactly what it is. And some, of course, are conditional. So I want to make the point that what we have here is something that is malleable, and that's one reason that we have countries signing up to it. So what would success be? Well, one measure, success is a little like beauty. It's kind of in the eyes of the beholder. And one measure of success is whether we do better than business as usual, whether we do better for having COP21 than not, which is something in the real world you can never observe. And as I said, we don't really know what business as usual is. And secondly, you could ask, are we going to meet our collective goal, which say it's 2 degrees C change in mean global temperature? And if that's the case, then with what kind of probability? So you can see there's a lot of squishiness here in calculation of success. If you look at the UN Framework Convention Secretariat's own analysis, you'll see on the black part of the curve on the left, this is the increase in emissions from history. The orange part is a projection of business as usual emissions. You'll notice they're going up. The 2 little yellow bands there are where the Secretariat estimates will be with the INDCs if they are implemented, if they are fulfilled. And the blue lines are all where we should be going starting from today. And you'll notice particularly the inflection point at 2030 at the top level. So to have any chance, this is only to have a 50% chance of meeting 2 degrees C. We're rising to 2030, and then it looks like a miracle occurs, and things are coming down. And what I want you to think about is a miracle going to occur, or do we have to change what we're doing if we're going to transform behavior worldwide? So what should we want from COP21? Well, the first thing, I think there should be support for global solidarity around this issue. I think that's very important. I think it's important for every country to acknowledge that they're part of the problem and need to be part of the solution. Very important, there have to be strong provisions for measuring emissions, for reporting, and also for verification. That's fundamental. It's a precondition for any kind of enforcement in international cooperation. And then finally, the novelty that I see in the current draft, well, I haven't seen the latest draft, but the novelty I've been seeing in earlier drafts as compared with what we've been seeing for the last 25 years is this process for assessment and review. And I think it's very important that that be adopted because it needs to acknowledge that enforcement is the central problem in terms of changing behavior worldwide. But you really want to know, is this novelty, the assessment and review procedure, is this novelty really going to buy us something? And it's really impossible to tell by looking out into the real world because we'll never have the counterfactual of what would have happened from now forward without this process. That's the advantage of doing laboratory experiments where you can establish a control group that did not have an assessment review process and compare it to behavior in groups that do have that process. So this is research I've done with a colleague, Astrid Dannenberg, at the University of Kassel in Germany. I'll just describe our experiment. We have 5 players in a group. So this is a highly stylized but also realistic experiment involving real people playing for real money. So they're taking this game seriously. And each player starts with 5 cheap chips. You can give them away and it's not going to be very costly to you. And then they've got 15 expensive chips. And when a player contributes a chip, the entire group benefits, but the player, him or herself, is actually worse off directly for contributing that chip. But of course, all the players are better off if everyone contributes their chips. So there's this tension that everyone feels, and that's exactly the tension that you feel here in the negotiating rooms in Paris. If the players in total contribute too little, then there's a chance that the group will experience a kind of catastrophe, which means that everyone's going to lose a lump sum amount of money. And this group of people don't want to lose this money. And that threshold, I'm going to show you a picture next, is somewhere between 50 and 100 chips. So you can think of that as something like the threshold that people are imagining might be associated with a 2-degree change. So these are the results from our experiment. And what you're looking here are 4 different treatments from left to right. The one on the left, the far left, is for a treatment with no assessment review procedure. And the other 3 are with an assessment review procedure inserted at different stages of the game. And the bar on the left, the red bars, are the group targets that are proposed. And remember that the ideal behavior for the entire group is that everyone contributes all their chips. That would be 100 in total, and all the targets are below that. So no one's responsible for meeting this, and still the targets are too low. The next bar, the blue, are the pledges. They're even below the targets. And the final bar is what's actually done, the contributions, and they're in below the pledges. So if this experiment is to be believed, the countries that are agreeing to pledges now, knowing that there is a very high chance there will be an assessment review procedure, will not always fulfill their pledges. And if that sounds outrageous to you, if you go back in history, that's happened over and over again in the past. Another insight we get from the experiment is that some groups do rather well and some groups do quite poorly. And it depends on the characteristics of the players in the groups. There are certain people more inclined towards cooperation than others. And this raises the idea that if you can have a so-called club, a subset of players who can maybe strike out on their own and make more progress than the whole group, because the whole group is being dragged down by the behavior of the free riders. Now, the thing is that in dealing with a global problem, you can't just push the free riders out of the room. You need them to join you, so that the utility of having a club depends on the club being able to provide leverage to get the free riders to participate. And this is one of the things we need to focus on now after Paris. And there are different ways to think of doing this. One is through collective efforts by a kind of club that could bring down the cost of technologies that are alternative to fossil fuels. If this happens, then this would spread worldwide without the need for enforcement. Another possibility is to have what I would call coordination treaties. And one good example of that is the decision taken last month to negotiate an amendment to the Montreal Protocol to control hydrofluorocarbons. This would actually work because the Montreal Protocol has an effective enforcement mechanism. And some people have heard, Bill Nordhaus at Yale University has a proposal for a more generalized form of trade restrictions. This is a more provocative idea, but it may be that we'll need to take more radical steps in the future. And then finally, if you really want to take seriously the desire to stabilize concentrations, which means having to bring emissions worldwide to zero, think about the scale of that aspiration, that goal. I think we need to be open to the idea of pursuing backstop approaches, and that would mean using a technology, especially an industrial process, to remove carbon dioxide directly out of the air. And this approach could be done by a club. I think I'd probably use the term a coalition of the willing. It's likely that this technology would be expensive, but it's the only backstop technology we have for climate change. And I think as we look forward, it would be useful now to develop R&D to bring down the costs and to define and make clear for us what the cost of this backstop technology would be, because we need to know as we devise policies now how to transition possibly to this kind of backstop. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott, for having provided an overview of the difficult tasks and challenges beyond this COP21. Next paper follows some similar research direction by going into a more detailed presentation and description of the INDCs and assessing the INDCs, not just in terms of effectiveness, are they consistent with a 2-degree target, but also in terms of economic costs and distribution of these costs and efficiency, economic efficiency of the measures that will be adopted to implement the INDCs. The speaker is Professor Tavoni, professor of the Polytechnic Institute of Milan, and also program director at FEEM, Eni Mattei Foundation. Massimo, thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlo. It's very weird to speak to an audience with headphones. You tend to shout a lot because you think no one is hearing you. I'm probably shouting. Just tell me if that happens. Yeah, so let me take again a national top-down approach, in the words of the order before, starting from the national INDCs. And let me start from where Scott left. In a way, let me take an optimistic view here. Let's assume the INDCs are actually, in fact, agreed upon. They are not just intended, but actually meant and actually enforced. The enforcement problem, I agree with Scott, is not an easy one. Let's assume for once that the enforcement problem is solved. Still, we are still left with questions which are important, even if the enforcement is solved, which are, how effective are they, the INDCs? And by effective, we actually mean what kind of temperature can we achieve with the INDCs? How efficient are they? Are they costly? Are we doing them in the wrong way from an economic point of view? Can we do more at the same cost? Or can we do the same at the lower cost? And last, not least, of course, is how equitable are they? Is it a question of fairness, which is, of course, a key one in negotiations? So we use a model, an integrated assessment model. So it's a tool that we developed at FEEM and which is used to analyze ex ante policies such as the INDCs, and which was used extensively in the latest assessment report of the IPCC. Where there are many scenarios that you can actually download for free. There are actually more than 1,000 scenarios in the IPCC database, which Working Group 3 which I encourage you to have a look, and we contributed with this tool to a substantial fraction of those. So let me start from effectiveness. So here we are, and you have seen similar slides. You see the projections in emission till 2030 under business as usual in red and under INDCs. And what emerges from this is that the INDCs, if they are properly implemented, and if everyone follows through, would achieve emission reductions which are not insignificant, are actually pretty significant. Now, of course, BAU is a counterfactual. We don't know exactly where that stands. But the fact that INDCs would bring emissions roughly a little bit higher, but roughly similar to where we are today, I think is a good sign that goes against the current and historical trends, which have seen emission rising over time and rising even more rapidly in the past decades than before. So INDCs are turning that if they are implemented. Now, of course, the question is, are they compatible with 2 degrees? And everyone is asking this question, and kind of everyone thinks that's pretty obvious. In fact, it's not very obvious to me. You see overlaid here all the 2 degree scenarios, 2 degree compatible scenarios. 2 degree means many different things, but with a certain probability of achieving 2 degrees, which is significant, coming from the IPCC, and you see that those INDCs are above what would be optimal to do in 2030, but not completely far off. The question is what is going to happen after 2030. And so the question is how to project those forward and intensify their level of effort. So here, for example, we extrapolated beyond 2030 the INDCs, assuming the level of commitment, in this case in terms of carbon cost, carbon prices, increase every year, and increase every year at different rates. It is 1% per year, which is the red scenarios, 3%, the green, and 5%, which are the blue scenarios that you see there, both for the low and high pledges in 2030. Now, if what you see there is even if we increase the level of commitment in 2030 by increasing carbon prices 5% every year, which is a significant rise in time, similar to the interest rate, that would still not achieve 2 degrees. So the question is not so much are the INDCs compatible with 2 degrees, but the question really is how can we intensify those INDCs and bring countries which have not committed large emission reduction on board as well post 2030 to get to 2 degrees. Because that gap remains, and even with those targets we would be above 3 degrees or certainly above 2.5 degrees. In terms of effectiveness though, even with these current INDCs, by 2030 things will change. And there will be quite a bit of restructuring of the energy system. This is, for example, the capacity investments installed capacity in 2030 in the power sector globally, and also in 2010. 2010 is in blue, 2030 is in red. Now what you see is, of course, today actually the coal fleet is dominating the power sector, followed by gas and then renewables. Now by 2030, even with current INDCs, though, that picture would change. We would have the renewables having the largest capacity, not the largest production, to be sure. We're talking about capacity here. Renewables operate at lower capacity factor, but highest capacity, then followed by gas. So we are twisting and we are changing the picture, even with current INDCs, towards much greener solutions which involve renewables and gas, and which, by the way, also involve coal. As you see, coal would also increase. Why? Because countries which have not committed significant INDCs would invest in coal. And there you would still see an increase of coal. And maybe that's the bad sign in terms of effectiveness. But for the rest, looking at renewables and gas, the INDCs are going at least in the right direction towards greener and less carbon-intensive sources, at least in the power sector. We can skip this one, actually. And let's go to the efficiency. So we talked about effectiveness. Efficiency for economies means cost. Are we doing it at the low cost possible? And the question is pretty obviously, no, we are not. And as Eduardo was mentioning before, why are we not doing this? This is textbook economics. We have marginal costs, which are those diamonds across the different regions that you see in these charts, which are different. You see, there are diamonds which have marginal cost, carbon prices which are very low, even zero, in some countries, and in some other countries those costs are very high, or above even $100 a ton of CO2. What you see also is that line, and that is the carbon price which we would have if we were assume trading of CO2. So an unrestricted use of international offsets, okay? If we were allowed to trade freely emission reductions, given these INDCs, that would be the price that we would set in the market. Now that of course is a limiting case. We cannot open, from the experience of the CDM we know we cannot open trade to the full extent possible. But still, this chart indicates that those gap between the diamonds and that dotted line represent the efficiency gains, how much we can reduce the cost of those countries which has carbon prices higher than $16 per ton of CO2, which in this case would be countries which would buy permits on the market, and those countries which are below, you see in the green arrows, would have a higher price but would sell permits to the market and make money through this. So there is scope for increasing efficiency for sure. We can skip this one. And let's move to equity. Is this equitable or not? Now this is a chart showing you GDP per capita, which is the wealth of nations on the x-axis, and the marginal cost, the carbon price, on the y-axis. And if you look at and judge by this metric, actually it's pretty equitable. It turns out that the relation between wealth and income and the marginal price, the carbon prices, is almost linear. Not exactly, but a bit less than linear. So if your nation is 10% richer than my nation, my country, then you are taking, your carbon price is 7% higher than mine. Not 10%, 10% would be perfect neutrality, but still almost. So you see there's a relation higher, that the wealthy countries which have a lot higher GDP per capita have higher prices, the poorer countries have lower prices. This makes sense. In this sense, this is equitable. We can skip this and let me conclude. So how effective, how efficient, and how equitable is this? I think in terms of effectiveness, if we assume everything goes through, there are non-trivial reduction from BAU. Repercussion on investments in renewables and in gas especially, and away from coal. But it needs to be strengthened to attain climate stabilization. And especially, we need to think about mechanism for which we can project forward beyond 2030 and provide a signal to those investments which last 40 years, 50 years. Those investments in coal cannot be made today. Otherwise, though, we will never achieve 2 degrees or even 2.5 or even 3. How efficient? Not very efficient. There's a large price gaps. We can, increase efficiency certainly by trading of CO2. At least the good thing is that the carbon prices will be high in those countries which have more capacity to innovate, especially in the US and in Europe and Japan and industrialized regions. So the R&D investments coming out from the INDCs, from our exercises, are quite significant. We are talking about roughly $20 billion per year of R&D investment in clean energy coming out from the INDCs, which is a significant number. How equitable? I would say relatively equitable, if measured especially marginal cost. Things change a little bit when we actually account for the full economic cost. There are issues about international trade that I didn't go into detail, but equity-wise, at least equity measured in this way, it's relatively okay. So if everything goes through, I think it's not a bad start. It can be improved along the lines, but at least it's getting us on the right track. Thanks.
Thank you, Massimo. And as promised, we are moving to a general assessment, to more specific one, regional or local assessments of policy measures that will be necessary in order to implement the INDCs. The first of these different approaches to the problem will be delivered by Almut Arneth. She heads the Division on Ecosystem and Atmosphere Interaction at the Department of Atmospheric Environmental Research at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. Her contribution here is the outcome of this collaboration with the University of Edinburgh, and I'm quite grateful to both of you, so thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone to be here rather than reading the exciting new piece of text that's just come out. So I'm going to talk about ecosystem services and natural capital, and I actually sort of decided to shorten this rather lengthy title into a quote from a, not the previous one, a quote from a colleague that recently came out in Nature, which is basically forests are more than carbon sticks. And just to remind those in the room who are perhaps not fully familiar with the natural capital and ecosystem services concept, so natural capital is basically a stock of natural resources. It's in economic terms, for instance, the carbon that is stored in a forest ecosystems. The ecosystem services is provided through the existence of the natural capital or the change in the natural capital to human societies. So that could be, for instance, the climate regulation through carbon uptake in forests. One more. So we're talking typically in terms of ecosystem services, we're talking about provisioning ecosystem services so that we're providing food, for instance, or timber. Next one. We have regulating ecosystem services, so we climate regulation, for instance, through carbon fluxes. There's cultural ecosystem services, which would be the sort of, the spirituality of us perceiving our natural environment, or also the recreation that we're getting from our natural environment. And finally, the supporting ecosystem services, which would be, for instance, the net primary productivity in a forest ecosystem, just very briefly. Now, you might want to ask yourself, what do ecosystem services actually have to do with governance? And I think one very simple view, perhaps, which I think needs to be stated, is that global governance, but also local governance, of course, including the governance of our environment, is an absolute must for achieving sustainable development. And the little slide, the diagram that I've put up here, is admittedly a bit of an ecosystem-centric perspective of governance. So you have policy decisions and how these are implemented on the ground at the top. And then everything else in those green services sort of somehow relates to ecosystems. So we need to understand our ecosystems. We need to understand the ecosystem services provided from them. We can value those, so we can actually really put values to benefits and costs of ecosystem management. And I think so the idea, of course, is that all of that needs robust scientific understanding of ecosystem process in order to feed into global assessments that also then feed into policy making. Next one, please. Okay, so what are typical trade-offs? And I'm going to really focus here on land use change and climate mitigation, in a sense, in a broader framework. So typically, when we're talking about promotion of bioenergy to, for instance, reach a 2-degree target, then quite often this promotion of bioenergy is completely neglecting all kinds of other issues related to sustainability, for instance, biodiversity issues. When we're sort of planting the full world in crops, then we don't have much space for recreation and conservation. Then there's policies related to reforestation and afforestation, and again in terms of ecosystem service provision beyond climate services, it really depends very much where those forests are grown, whether you have trade-offs or whether you have co-benefits with other ecosystem services. And then in a more general sense, actually general climate mitigation measures, reduction of, emissions, a climate mitigation pathway, actually also has, from an ecosystem perspective, also benefits that could potentially be reduced. If we have lower CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which we all want, because that sort of, reduces climate change, that actually also affects some ecosystem properties, photosynthesis of trees, negatively. So the real question that we need to sort of assess is, previous one, please, yeah, is how we better understand these climate regulation services in a changing environment with the view of other, sustainability issues involved as well. And I'm going to show you 2 examples that are based on so-called dynamic global vegetation models. These are basically models that simulate vegetation, distribution, ecosystem processes, both in natural and in managed ecosystems, in response to environmental changes. They kind of, produce state of ecosystems in terms of natural capital and ecosystem services. And the important thing is really they can do that geographically specific, and they sort of change in space and time. And this is just a map down here to sort of, show you, for instance, the distribution of global biomes produced by such a DGVM. Next one. So the example number 1 is actually related to the ecosystem service of yields, of crop yields. And what was done is an ensemble modeling simulation of 6 global crop models, jointly with 5 climate change projections. and they run that for basically a no climate mitigation pathway, the RCP 8.5 from the IPCC report, and a very strong climate mitigation pathway, the RCP 2.6. And then they assessed the climate effects on crop yields as well as the CO2 effects on crop yields, and sort of, expressed that in terms of the difference between those scenarios as avoided damage if you're reducing from strong climate warming to little climate warming, and the lost potential if you're reducing from a high CO2 world to a low CO2 world. Next one. And that's the map that comes out of it. So that is basically the ensemble mean from those simulations. And what you're seeing here is the change in crop yields globally, combined for maize, wheat, soy, and rice at the end of the 21st century, expressed again as the avoided damage if you're kind of implementing climate mitigation. And the green areas basically say that if we are going on a 2.6 pathway compared to 8.5, we're avoiding 100% damage in, let's say, large parts of Africa, South America, but also in actually parts of the US. Whereas the future potentials, the lost potential by actually running the crops at a lower CO2 concentration is showing up mostly in terms of the red areas in the northern hemisphere. So in those areas, a higher climate change world would actually be beneficial to crop yields because these areas are quite cool at the moment, so if it warms we can grow more, and the crops would actually benefit from higher CO2 concentrations. So no one says, of course, that we should reduce crop yields due to climate change, particularly in those areas that are already suffering today. But if you put one more, it just really shows you a very nice example, I find, that the regional patterns of ecosystem responses to a changing environment is very variable. And we really need to consider this regional diversity when we want to assess impacts of climate change mitigation policies. Importantly, this analysis, of course, has been assuming today's management, so there's no change in crop area in there and only very limited sort of additional adaptation. So I think it doesn't really show, but I think it makes a very strong point that if we want to sort of develop internationally agreed assessments of mitigation effects on ecosystems, we can't do that as natural scientists alone. We need to actually come much better to a bridging between the natural sciences and the socioeconomic knowledge. Just very briefly, example number 2 now really goes into the land use change issue. It sort of goes away from the climate change into the land use change issue. And again, what we've done, we've run a dynamic global vegetation model with idealized land use change projections. So they're not real policy cases. It's an idealized case where BECCS was maximized while still feeding the world. There was afforestation and avoided deforestation maximized by still feeding the world, and compared to a reference case of RCP 2.6. Next one. And that's how it looks like in terms of the percentage change in land cover, expressed here as crops, pasture in blue, and natural/forest vegetation in green. And what you're seeing is that for the reference case, the BECCS case, and the avoided deforestation ADAF case, for instance, in the avoided deforestation case, the percentage change in vegetation between now and the end of the 21st century increases relatively large in terms of forest cover, which is what you'd expect. Next one. That's the effects on carbon cycle ecosystem services. So what you're seeing at the top panel is the change in vegetation carbon pool in response to those scenarios. And the top one is the change in total carbon pool in response to these scenarios. Again, a percentage change present day into the future. And interestingly, in all 3 scenarios, we're actually seeing an increase in vegetation carbon pool, irrespective of the quite different changes in the land area contribution of those 3 land cover types. And that again is mostly because there's also the CO2 fertilization effect. So even though, for instance, in a BECCS scenario, we have a large crop yield increase, we have also a large natural forest carbon cycle increase because of the CO2 fertilization. And a similar kind of picture also arises for the total carbon storage in ecosystems. So next one. So from a carbon climate service perspective, those different scenarios of land cover, of course, again, affect the carbon cycle very differently. We have an increase of carbon pools in all of them, the largest in afforestation. But the question, of course, then is how it's going to interact with other ecosystem services. Next one. And this is my last slide, and it shows basically, again, a sort of the simulation output for the same scenarios, but now looking at a broader range of ecosystem services, moving beyond the vegetation and the total carbon, which is still up here as the pale and dark green. But if you're looking, for instance, at the dark blue and the pale blue scenario, which is looking at runoff, and if we're just concentrating again on the afforestation scenario, what we're actually seeing is a relative increase compared to the reference case of evapotranspiration, the sort of pale blue one, but a decrease in runoff. And you can see this decrease of runoff as something that is actually a bit of a concern, because that runoff might actually you want to use for irrigating crops. It could also be, nearly done, it could also be positive if that runoff is as floods. So that is sort of something that really needs to be looked at. And sort of similar issues arise actually for ecosystem services related to air quality and to crop NPP. But since my time is up, I'm going to sort of quickly conclude, if you don't mind. Just quickly flag through that, go to the last slide. So when we're saying, forests are more than sticks of carbons, and ecosystems, I think, in general, are more than carbon dumps, we really need to, come to an understanding that we have very different ecosystems on the globe with very different functioning, very different natural capital and derived ecosystem services. So if you want to assess the side effects of land-based mitigations, which could be negative as trade-offs, but also positive in terms of co-benefits, we really need to identify and manage unexpected outcomes. And that, I think, is still a very big challenge. So the governance of land management that enhances both climate services, but also other sustainabilities and biodiversity is a big challenge, and we have to sort of address that if we want to maintain this global climate livable, even, from beyond the climate perspective, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll move, as promised, to the local level. We went through the regional level with this quite interesting presentation. Now we move to the local level with an analysis of urban greenhouse gas emission. Professor Christopher Kennedy from the University of Toronto is here with us. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation.
And thank you for inviting me to present here. It's a pleasure to be here. As indicated, there's really two parts to my presentation. I'm going to talk about the factors that underlie greenhouse gas emissions from cities as the first part, and the second part I'm going to talk about strategies for mitigating those emissions. And I'm particularly going to talk about electrification, the use of electricity replacing fossil fuels in all forms of urban energy use, as being a really important and key strategy for reducing our emissions from cities. With regard to the drivers, I'm primarily going to be talking from a production-based perspective, from a technology perspective. If you take a more consumer perspective, then the drivers are really income and wealth, as was already covered by Eduardo. And so the solutions are also economic. But next slide, please. This is an interesting slide just to really reinforce why cities are so important in mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. What you see in this graph in front of you is a well-known fact by the blue diamonds passing the green triangles that there's more people living in cities than in rural areas these days. What I've done is I've superimposed upon that the increase in global energy use, which is the red line, and you see that global energy use is actually directly proportional to the number of people living in cities, and actually passed this statistical test to show that. And essentially, as more and more people have moved to cities, our global energy use has been going up. Next slide, please. I'm a data guy. I'm a technical guy. I collect a lot of numbers. I do lots of graphs. You'll see that in the next few slides. Underlying the work that we've done on greenhouse gas emissions inventories for cities is a bit of science. We actually collect a lot of data. We call it the urban metabolism. We collect a lot of data on energy use in cities, waste production, production of materials, and it's the energy use and the wastewater and the solid waste and the steel and the cement that actually underlies the calculation of the greenhouse gas inventory for cities. And we use the same procedures that are broadly done at the national level, using the IPCC procedures, but applied down to the city level. So next slide. Here's an example of some of the energy data we've collected in a very recent study. We had a team of 28 researchers around the world, and we collected all of the energy use from all of the world's megacities. Those are metropolitan regions greater than 10 million people. Here I'm looking at the total energy use. It's not per capita. You can see some remarkable stories. New York, with 22 million people, actually uses more energy than Tokyo, which has 34 million people. And in terms of the per capita, the New York and Moscow are about 25 times higher in their energy use than those poor South Asian cities such as Kolkata and Mumbai that you can see at the bottom there. And so this is the data that underlies the greenhouse gas emissions. And what you see at the national level plays out at the city level. The big wealthy cities generally are using more energy, and that will lead to more greenhouse gas emissions as well. Next slide, please. I'm actually switching gears a little bit. If you are following the individual cities closely, I actually have two data sets that play in this presentation. This is an older data set. It's not the mega cities, although some of the cities in this slide are mega cities. What you see here is some work we did. It's in the paper last year, but it really goes back about 5 to 10 years, where we've calculated the greenhouse gas emissions for a range of global cities. The general picture is that the North American cities are higher in their emissions per capita than the European cities, although some of the Asian cities are as high as the European cities. And if I was showing trends here, the Asian cities are generally growing in their GHGs per capita, whereas many of the North American, or at least the leading North American and European cities, are beginning to decrease their emissions per capita. But a place like Dar es Salaam is still sort of a factor of 40 below a city like Denver in terms of its GHG per capita. Let's dive inside this a little bit more and try and understand some of the differences. So in the next slide, please. Here's one factor. Climate actually has a role in the energy use in cities. So what I'm showing here is the energy consumption on the y-axis, that's gigajoules per person, as a function of what we call heating degree days. I'm not going to unpack heating degree days, but basically it's a measure of how cold a place is. So colder cities use more energy for heating. That makes sense, right? So there's a bit of scatter in the diagram because we've also got industrial fuels mixed in with the data set. That's just the way the data comes. So obviously in a more industrial city such as Shanghai is above the line, whereas a less industrial city such as Paris, Ile-de-France, where we are now, which is more based on tourism and other forms of economy, it's below the line. Next slide, please. One of the things we've done, this is actually going back to the megacities data, one of the things we've done recently is get a really good handle on how electricity consumption per person varies with the shape of cities and the aspects of cities. And I know this is a bit of a complicated three-dimensional graph here, but basically speaking, there's a very high correlation between the sprawl of a city, the spread of the city, and the amount of square footage for building area. Those two are highly correlated. And when you put the two of those together, they can largely explain most of the electricity consumption from cities. You can see Osaka and Los Angeles at the top there with very high electricity per capita. They're quite spread out. They have a lot of building for square footage essentially. But with electricity, there is another factor which is possibly more important. Oh yeah, next slide please. Which is the carbon intensity of the electricity supply. And Eduardo already had this on one of his slides. So I've put that on that kind of odd, strange second y-axis here. So you can see for this example, Toronto actually uses a lot more electricity than Cape Town there. Toronto's about 10 megawatt hours per capita. Cape Town's down below 4. But actually, Cape Town's greenhouse gas emissions from electricity are higher than Toronto's because Cape Town's burning a lot of coal. Toronto's now on nuclear and hydro. Actually, Toronto's emissions are lower than are shown there in the last few years. And it's all because of the nature of the energy supply. And this quantity, carbon intensity of electricity, tons of CO2 equivalent per gigawatt hours, is possibly the most important quantity to focus on as we move to a low carbon world. It's the thing that we have to work on most, as I'll explain in the second part of the presentation, which I'm going to move to now. Next slide, please. When you sit back, so I've spent 20 years studying carbon emissions from cities, working at national scale as well as local scale, and I'm going to bridge the two a little bit here. When you look at the sort of the broad technological approaches to getting to a zero carbon or a very low carbon world, there's essentially biofuels and the bio-based approach, which has problems because of ecosystem services, which have sort of been covered there. And the other broad approach is to electrify everything and generate low carbon electricity. And I actually believe that it's that latter approach that will be the only way we will successfully deal with our climate change problems. And so the future, in a sense I'm saying there's a silver bullet solution. Of course it's not that simple. There's obviously differentiated approaches. But the key idea here, it is that the development of electric cities will be the most important way forward to bringing down our global greenhouse gas emissions. Electric cities means, a simple example, instead of driving gasoline cars, we can be driving electric cars. But of course, those electric cars have to be powered by low carbon electricity. And so on the next slide, please, let me reinforce the importance of electricity and why it should be the sector that we concentrate on most. First of all, it already accounts for about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions in Annex 1 countries, probably higher in others. Electricity consumption is highly correlated with economic growth. In fact, it's a leading variable in time series analysis. And as our economies continue to grow, electricity use will increase in this, on this planet. There's no doubt about that. Even if we do as much conservation as we can, electricity consumption will continue to grow. As I've already said, electrification is probably the most central, possibly the only way we will drastically reduce our emissions in a deep decarbonization scheme. And I'll go to the next slide, please. Here's an example of that. There's been some really good work by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network in Italy, which is based here in Paris. This is just one example of one country they've done in their work. It's a Canada chapter. They've got these reports called Pathways to Deep Decarbonization. And the three prongs in their approaches are energy efficiency, first of all, which actually is, it sounds odd, but that's actually easier to do than than the other two. The second pillar is decarbonization of electricity. Canada, for example, is phasing out coal. Ontario's got rid of it. Other jurisdictions are no longer building coal power. Reducing that carbon intensity of electricity again. And then the third pillar is electrification of end uses, increasing the amount of electricity that is used in place of other energy sources. So next slide. And so here's actually possibly the most important slide in my whole presentation, which I sneaked into Nature just earlier this year. It's called the key threshold for electrification. If we are going to electrify, if electrification is the key strategy, we've got to decarbonize electricity supply. It turns out there is a rough number of about 600 tons per gigawatt hour, at which, if you're below that as a country or as a city, when you electrify stuff, you reduce your life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. If you're above that number and you drive the electric car in a place with high carbon electricity, you're actually transferring the emissions from the tailpipe to the power station. And so countries are going to have to get below that, as a very short-term goal, get below that number of about 600 tons per gigawatt hour. And so in particular, it's the India, Australia, China, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia amongst the high emitters that have got to get below that. And there's actually some good progress amongst those nations in doing so. So next slide. So this is actually my last slide. I'm going to conclude on this. This is the playing field from the technical person's perspective, if you like, from the city geek that studies numbers on cities. This is a playing field that I come to when I want to think about how well a city's doing, how are they progressing to a low-carbon future for us all. It's all about, and it's shown here with the megacities, it's all about following that green arrow there. It's about reducing the carbon intensity of electricity supply, whether that's wind or solar or other renewables, hydropower, even nuclear, if that's considered acceptable in the country where that is. But it's also increasing the percentage of electricity in the energy mix, and you can see there's a bit of a mixed bag there with the megacities, but this is the key playing field you need to keep your eye on as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Now we have one last presentation because Federica Rangieri, because of family reason, cannot be here. Federica is from the World Bank, and she cannot present the paper that she was supposed to. But we have one additional presentation. It will not be from Patrick Biard, because Patrick as well cannot be in Paris today. But his work is a joint work with Benedetta Lucchita and a team from Bocconi University, as Edoardo Croci just mentioned at the beginning. So Benedetta is going to present what Patrick was going to do and cannot do today.
Yes, I confess I'm not Patrick Biard, but since Bocconi University is one of the main partners in COP Energy project, I'm going to present the main insights of the project. I'm going to start from the driving forces for multi-level governance at subnational level, I will pass through a brief presentation of the project, and I will end with the successful factors of the project. So, as you know, climate and energy policy strategies are a mix of top-down and bottom-up approaches. Top-down approaches are regulatory schemes like EU directives or regional and local laws. And instead, the bottom-up approaches are voluntary schemes like the Covenant of Mayors, the Compact of Mayors, Mayors Adapt, and so on. In this framework, the role of regional authorities is important because they should scale up local actions and link it with the EU directives. And in the last years, about 8,000 cities have adopted voluntary mechanisms to implement and develop climate energy action plans. So there is an increased need for coordination between subnational levels for a more effective implementation of the actions, and this could be achieved through the implementation of multi-level governance models. The main drivers of multi-level governance at a metropolitan level are sources of renewable energy, coherence with the regional plans, and coherence also with the spatial planning. At municipal level, the drivers are technical skills in energy planning, connections for resource efficiency solutions, funding, and financial resources, and at least availability of energy data. Also in this case, regional authority have to coordinate metropolitan areas and municipality through innovative financial schemes, smart energy grids, natural resource use, and conflict management, through the effective cross-boundary resource efficiency solution supply chains, and through the engagement of all the stakeholders and the awareness raising. The other drivers that are more general are the need for synergies and economies of scales to share experiences and to save resources. The need to take into account new administrative levels and the civil society and the private actors. All these factors leads to an increased need for collaborative and structured multi-level governance in sustainable energy planning. And the COP Energy project tried to answer to this necessity through the implementation and promotion of effective multi-level governance models to develop sustainable energy planning between regional and local public authorities. The main results of COP Energy project are collected in a survey report of 200 multi-level governance coordination cases, an analysis of 60 best practice of European cities, and an handbook for multi-level governance cooperation. So you can find all this information on the project site that is copenergy.eu. So I'm going to skip all the part of the explanation of the best practices, and I will jump to the conclusions that are the successful factors. The first one is a shared vision. A shared vision and political commitment is in place and at regional and local levels. Second, partnership working. Regional and local public authorities are working in close cooperation. Stakeholders' involvement. All the stakeholders are engaged in the initiative. Funding availability. Energy and planning expertise. The public authorities, at least at regional level, have to have access to planning expertise in different fields like technical, regulatory, and financing. The last successful factor is multi-level governance, facilitating processes or structures. That means that organizational structures and processes that facilitate the development of multi-level governance agreements are already operational. Thank you.
Thank you. The conclusion of this side event was supposed to be delivered by the Italian Minister of the Environment, but fortunately, or unfortunately, certainly fortunately, the new text of the Paris Agreement has just been delivered, and all ministers, in particular EU ministers, are now gathering in order to prepare the next negotiation step, which is starting at 5. So we are not lucky not to have the minister here, but lucky enough to have here the Italian ambassador in Paris, and we're very pleased and honored to have Dr. Gian Domenico Magliano here for the conclusion of this side event.
Thank you, Chair. As you said, it's good to have a semi-final draft today rather than tomorrow, so that we can work this afternoon and tonight and to finalize hopefully tomorrow evening a text to be adopted on Friday. I thank you, Fondazione Enrico Mattei, Università Bocconi, Edinburgh University, the World Bank, and all the different actors here this afternoon. You have organized a workshop that Minister Galletti was eager to follow, because the leaders, after the meeting the 30th of November, and the chief negotiator, they are willing to adopt a document, a final agreement. Nonetheless, this is only the beginning of the process, the starting point, and it's up not only to government but to civil society, business, NGOs, citizens to implement it. The government will adopt new policies, they will abide to new rules, but enforcement is a bottom-up process. It cannot be a top-down process, otherwise will not end up in achieving the goal that will be adopted, be it below 2% Celsius or around it, or 1.5 as some groupings are asking for. But if you have a goal, you have to have actors to adopt it. Here, during this workshop, there have been fun presentations on different strategies, different options, measuring the gaps between national, intended national contributions and the goal that is set. Let's say it's not going beyond 2%. One element which is very important, it's clear from the different presentation, is that insofar you have a momentum, insofar you apply new tools, new policies, new standards on a given territory, on a given part of the economic sector, then probably technology will help, success will call for success. So even if nowadays projecting the national contributions, we can say that we are not up to the goal, probably once you start the process, you put in motion the different actors, then you will accelerate, because there are synergies across different sectors, because there are synergies between different systems, ETS, tax carbon, credit system standards, because there are synergies disregarding the level of emissions nowadays. And countries that are announcing a modest goal or a modest contribution, they will be in a position to accelerate. Finance, of course, will help. Finance means investment in capacity building, investing in the energy sector, in energy efficiency, revamping, readjusting our energy mix, putting infrastructures in motion where we do not have infrastructure. And then to conclude, I would like also to add with a more political element, global warming is a danger for the planet. Climate control is a public good, as it is peace, as it is health, as it is education. And once you have a sustainable model of development, you not only you achieve climate targets, but you achieve also other targets which are related to other goals. You reduce pressure on water resources, you reduce pressure on nature, on agricultural crops, you can feed better the 2 extra billion of people living in the planet by the end of the century. So what we agreed upon in New York a couple of months ago, the Sustainable Development Goals, means that climate control, water resources safeguard, health, education, fight to hunger, they are mutually reinforcing public goods. And once you have ownership by the citizens and not only top-down from the governments, once you have academia helping, spelling out the different policies, being transparent in measurement, in reporting, then we'll be in a position to deliver to the new generation a better world. Thank you.